Later. With everything else fighting for room in my head, I must confess that Mom and Dad's important meeting didn't seem very important to me. That's why it took me by surprise. I came downstairs, I heard Mom's voice tense and upset. I want this thing to be over with, completely finished, everyone gone by the time that the parents get here. Dad wasn't just as tense. What? And you think I don't? I don't want them butting in on this. They were setting up in the great room, setting up as if for a homeowners meeting. They arranged 10 chairs facing the fireplace for the guests and another 10 chairs off to the side by the kitchen. These chairs, as it turned out, were for the families. Um, Whose families? The Fishers and the Bowers. And as the guests arrived, they were handed sheets of paper by Dad. I took one myself and I read it. It was a list of items that had been stolen from houses in Lake Windsor Downs, as compiled by the Tangerine County Sheriff's Department. There were notations like Rolex watch, $900 recovered, and pearls, antique, $500 not recovered. By 1 o'clock, all of the guests had been seated. I knew who most of them were. They were from Joey Street, the street where all of the houses had been tinted. That's what they all had in common. The white Tudor, the gray Lancaster, the yellow Stuart. Today, they were all the same. Today, they were all the blue tints. The chairs off to the side were occupied by Mom, Dad, Arthur Bauer Sr., Mrs. Bauer, who I'd never seen before, and Paige Bauer. Arthur Bauer Sr. looked angry. The rest of them looked sick at heart. Arthur Bauer Jr. had joined Eric out on the patio, and the two of them were slouching silently. Mom and Dad had set out a pair of chairs for them to sit next to their families, but they weren't sitting in them. I wasn't sitting in my family chair either. I chose a place on the couch next to the coffee table. Mom stood up to open the meeting, but before she spoke, she turned and looked outside at Eric. Then she walked into the kitchen, opened the patio door, and said in a trembling voice, "Eric, would you come in here, please?" Neither Eric nor Arthur moved. Mom waited them out in front of everyone. Silence filled the great room like an embarrassing smell. Finally, Mom repeated, "Eric, would you come in here, please?" Arthur Bauer Sr. leaned around the corner and barked, "Arthur, get in here!" First Arthur, then Eric staggered to their feet and moved slowly inside to the empty chairs next to their families. When they sat down, there was a low gasp as the guests looked upon their horrible faces. Eric's nose was blood red and swollen. His eyes were mere slits and rimmed with black like a raccoon's. Believe it or not, Arthur looked worse. Arthur's face was covered with purple bumps and red cuts. His lips were cracked and swollen too. He looked out of place among the humans, like an ogre in a storybook. Mom picked up her notebook, opened it, and started to speak in an even, formal voice. On behalf of the Bauer family and the Fisher family, I want to thank you for coming. It is my duty to inform all of you of the following. She looked down at her notes and read, "On November 22nd, I made a shocking discovery. While out at our storage bin searching for boxes of winter clothing, I found a gym bag that did not belong there. When I opened this gym bag, I found a U.S. Army gas mask, a pair of rubber gloves, and a plastic supermarket bag filled with diamond earrings, watches, gold rings, and many other types of precious jewelry." This time there was a loud gasp from the audience, including me. That afternoon, I spoke with Sergeant Edwards of the Tangerine County Sheriff's Department. You probably know his name. Sergeant Edwards confirmed that the items in the gym bag matched the descriptions of the items that were stolen from your homes while they were tinted. Mom closed the notebook and made eye contact with the guest. It didn't take a genius to figure out the rest. These items were stolen by Eric Fisher and Arthur Bauer. They've admitted as much. They have no choice but to admit it. Arthur used the gas mask to enter the homes, and then he stole items from the homes while Eric kept watch outside. She pulled out a copy of the sheet that each guest had been given. "We have recovered some of the items already. My husband will tell you more about that. Eric and Arthur gave some of your things away, and we're working on getting them back." Mom nodded at Paige. Paige Bauer has already returned the items that were given to her. Her friend Tina Turrington, who agreed to come here today but who obviously has not shown up, has already returned what she was given to her. They have also provided us with the names of other Lake Windsor High students who received stolen items from Eric and Arthur. We have contacted the parents of all of those students and are confident that we will be able to get back those stolen items. Mom stared blankly at the guest for a minute, then said, "My husband has more to say to you." Dad stood up as Mom sat down. He picked up where she left off. "That's right. Sergeant Edwards is the Tangerine County officer in charge of all of your cases. He has allowed us, and by us I mean the Fishers and the Bowers, to approach all of you with a plan to make restitution. That is, Eric and Arthur will make full restitution to all of you for your stolen property. If any item cannot be recovered and returned, Mr. Bauer and I will guarantee its full value to you in cash." Dad held up his copy of the list of stolen items. You can see what we've already recovered. Those items could be released to you as early as tomorrow. If we can get all of you to agree to this restitution plan, and it has to be a unanimous agreement, then the sheriff's department will not pursue further charges against Eric and Arthur. I felt sorry for Dad at that moment. He just couldn't give up. He had too much invested in the Eric Fisher football dream, and he just couldn't give up. I wanted to say, "Look at Eric's face, Dad. That's what he really looks like." But I kept quiet. The phone rang, so I leaned over the coffee table and grabbed the portable. It was Joey. He was practically screaming into the receiver. "The sheriff's deputies are at Arthur Bauer's house. They're sitting in a car out front." "Oh, yeah?" "Yeah, they stopped me on my bike. They asked if I knew where he was." "I know where he is." "Yeah? Where?" "He's right here." "Whoa, can I tell him?" "Yeah, why not?" Joey slammed down the phone. Arthur Bauer Sr. was speaking now. He was angry. "I've talked to my son about this. He's admitted his wrongdoing. He said he's sorry and he's made full disclosure of the facts. The question today is, do you want to prosecute these two dumb kids and possibly ruin their lives? Or do you want them to make full restitution to you, like men, and get on with their lives? Do you want to give them a second chance or not?" I searched the faces of the people from the blue tents. Their jaws were set. Their eyes were focused on the ugly faces of Eric and Arthur. The blue tents clearly felt no pity for these two thieves sitting in their chairs, staring at the floors, voiceless, useless, lifeless, like a pair of mannequins in a dumpster. One man spoke up against Mr. Bauer. He said, "Don't go blaming me for ruining your kid's life. I didn't ask your kid to break into my house." Mr. Bauer answered coldly, "No, of course you didn't." The man turned to the others and continued, "Why should they escape all punishment for their crimes? That's not justice. What if the cops nabbed two kids from Tangerine for robbing our houses? They'd be in jail right now." Mr. Bauer waved his list at him. "Yeah, and you'd never see your property again. This gets into the court system. You might never get your things back." The man shouted, "What is this, blackmail? If I don't agree, I don't get my stuff back?" He looked at the others. "We're getting robbed all over again." Mr. Bauer was furious but controlled. "Yeah, well, maybe you're the one person in the world who never did anything wrong in his life. Maybe you were born perfect. Maybe you were never a dumb kid once." The man didn't back down. "I'll tell you what I never did. I never broke into an old lady's bedroom and ransacked through her underwear drawer and stole her pearl necklace that was handed down to her by her own grandmother and then give it to my girlfriend like I was a big man or something. I never did that. And I don't know anybody else who did either. Your kid and that other kid are in a class all by themselves." Mr. Bauer didn't reply. He was so angry that he walked back to his seat and sat down, leaving no speaker at all in front of the meeting. Dad got up again and looked at them all and asked simply, "Do you accept our plan for making restitution or not?" What choice did they have? In the end, the blue tent people accepted the plan reluctantly. They agreed, reluctantly, to give Eric and Arthur that second chance. The second chance you get when your parents can guarantee full restitution. The second chance you get when you can kick a 50-yard field goal. The meeting broke up quickly. Mr. Bauer led his family directly to the door. The other guests started to file out solemnly, silently. But they stopped in their tracks. Something was blocking their passage. I hurried over to the side window and looked out. The first thing I saw was Joey. He was straddling his bike on the sidewalk. He was squinting in the sun. I looked to his left, and there they were, two sheriff's deputies. One thin with blonde hair, the other one big and muscular with a black mustache. Joey pointed out Arthur Bauer, and the two deputies started towards him. Arthur and his father stopped still, right in front of my window. The rest of the guests and the family squeezed out into the driveway. The big deputy asked, "Are you Arthur Bauer?" Arthur nodded meekly. The deputy said, "Extend both hands, please, Mr. Bauer." Arthur did, and the deputy calmly clicked a pair of handcuffs onto his wrist. His partner circled Arthur and started to pat him down, looking for a weapon. I hurried to the door and pushed my way through. The big deputy was reading Arthur his rights. "Arthur Bauer, you are under an arrest in connection with the murder of Luis Cruz. You have the right to remain silent." Arthur's face was paralyzed, in a state of shock, but when he heard the charge, he yelled out, "Wait a minute! Arthur, is that the guy you told me about? The guy at football practice?" Arthur, terrified, nodded his head repeatedly. His father continued, "Listen, officer, this is not right. This is a mistake. Arthur told me about this guy back when it first happened." The deputy, whose name tag read Sergeant Rojas, started walking with his prisoner, not listening. "Arthur told me about the guy who showed up at football practice looking for a fight. He didn't belong up there. He was just looking for trouble. Am I right, Arthur?" Arthur continued to nod. "He came up to Arthur and took a swing at him. So Arthur hit him back one time. Am I right?" Arthur nodded. "And that was the end of it. The guy came up there looking for a fight, and he found one. The guy didn't even belong there." I couldn't listen to this anymore. I shouted, "He belonged up there!" Arthur's father turned to see who had said this. I went on, "He belonged up there as much as you and your stupid kid do." I looked back at the blonde deputy. "The weapon he used to kill Luis Cruz was a blackjack." This made Sergeant Rojas stop in front of the door of the police cruiser. He turned to stare at me, so I added, "It's probably still in his Land Cruiser back at his house. I was there Friday night anyway." Sergeant Rojas called over. How do you know he used a blackjack? I saw him do it. I saw Arthur Bauer sneak up on Luis Cruz like a coward and hit him on the side of the head. Luis never saw it coming. Sergeant Rojas told the blond guy, get on over there and guard that vehicle until I get back. The blond guy took off running. Sergeant Rojas turned back to me. What else did you see? I looked up straight and faced them all, like I had seen Luis do. I heard Eric Fisher tell him to do it. The heads in the crowd all turned together towards Eric. Sergeant Rojas pointed one finger at him and ordered, You, get over here. Eric shuffled forward like he was already wearing leg irons. The sergeant demanded, Is that true? Eric looked at Dad. Dad repeated the words, Is that true? Eric hesitated for just a moment and then started to nod at Dad, at the sergeant, at everyone in the crowd. Steadily, up and down, he nodded to us all. Sergeant Rojas instructed Dad, You keep this young man in the house and not in the neighborhood, not in the yard, in the house. I may call or come back at any time, and I expect him to be there. Dad whispered that he understood. The sergeant turned his attention back to me. Do we have your statement, son? No, sir. I felt compelled to add. I wasn't brave enough to give my statement. He eyeballed me. You willing to give a statement now if called upon? Yes, sir. He put one hand on Arthur's head and pushed him down into the seat to the back of the cruiser. The rest of the Bowers hurried into the car to follow. I stood there with Joey and watched them pull away. The people from the meeting drifted off towards their homes, shaking their heads and talking. Joey held out his fist, and I banged mine down on his. He said, I'm going to hustle over to the Bowers and see what that deputy does. Okay, I'll talk to you later. Once Joey rode away, we found ourselves alone. Mom, Dad, Eric, and me. We walked together back up the driveway and into the garage. Eric stopped by the door, turned, and looked at me through his swollen eyes. I looked back at him through my thick lenses. He seemed to be struggling with something. Maybe a memory? Maybe he was reliving a scene from long ago. The four of us remained posed there, like we were frozen in time. Four frozen figures from the Wonders of the World exhibit. Mom finally broke the spell when she whispered to herself, Oh no, not now. We turned to see Grandmom and Grandpop walking up the driveway. Mom whispered again, What are we going to tell them? I knew the answer to that. We're going to tell them something bad, Mom. Grandmom and Grandpop stopped at the top of the incline, framed in the rectangular opening. Grandmom said, Caroline, have we come at a bad time? Mom shook her head. No, you're right on time. You're right here when you said you'd be. Grandpop looked at Eric. He asked him, What the hell happened to your eyes? Eric's answered him in a surprisingly strong voice. I got kicked in the face, Grandpop. Some kid kicked me in the face. Grandpop glanced over at me and then back at Eric. He gave him a short nod like he understood. Eric said, Excuse me, and then he opened the door and disappeared inside. Dad gestured to Grandmom and Grandpop to come in too. They exchanged a worried look and then started forward. Mom and Dad led us into the kitchen and sat at the round table. Grandmom and Grandpop looked me up and down. Then Grandmom asked her usual question. How are you, Paul? All right, I'm all right. Grandpop clapped me on the shoulder. That's good. I dragged over a stool from the counter so the five of us could sit around the table. Eric wasn't anywhere to be seen. I figured he'd gone upstairs to his room. Mom and Dad took turns talking just as they had done at the meeting. Grandmom and Grandpop didn't seem surprised by any of what they had heard. They took it all in without even blinking. When it was over, when we had told them every bad thing there was to tell, we paused and waited. Grandmom put her hand on her heart, sighed deeply, and said, You know what I'm going to tell you, Caroline. Mom closed her eyes. You're paying now for what you didn't do back then. Mom agreed with her completely. I know. But Dad wasn't so quick to surrender. He said curtly, That's easy to say now. It's easy enough 7 years after the fact to say I told you so. Grandmom replied flatly, We're not saying that. Grandpapa leveled his stare at him. We did tell you so. Eric did need help. He needed the doctor's help. Dad countered with, No, Eric did not need a doctor's help. He did not need drugs. He did not need to be one of those medicated kids who float around all the time like they're underwater. What drugs? We're not talking about drugs. The kid needed to know which end is up. That's all. First off, he needed to get his backside whipped for hurting Paul. Dad looked away. He clearly wanted out of this conversation. I guess we all did, because we sat there for a long minute in silence. Grandpop finally said, Okay, let me be the one to apologize. I don't have all the answers. I'm not saying I do. He said to Mom, We're family. That's all I know. We'll help you any way we can. He said to Grandmom, I think the best thing we can do right now is get down to Orlando and leave them alone. Mom tried half-heartedly to talk them out of it. Dad didn't say a word. He drifted off towards the great room. Mom said, At least take a tour of the house. That's what you came here for. Grandmom and Grandpop exchanged another look. Grandmom said, "A quick tour." I tagged along behind them on a fast lap around the ground floor. We passed by Dad sitting in his alcove in front of the IBM. I watched him as Mom pointed out things in the great room. He was sitting in a trance-like state in front of the screen with the green light of Eric scholarship offers file washing over his face. Mom described the top floor briefly, but she didn't take them up there. The tour ended in the foyer at the front door. Grandmom said, "It's a lovely house," and stepped outside. Grandpop, however, was not quite finished. He signaled, "Just a minute," and climbed up the stairs and turned left. He knocked, waited a moment, and then spoke quietly to Eric through the door. Then he came back down to Mom. He told her, "It's a beautiful house, all right. Nothing like those places I made you live in, huh?" Mom looked like she might cry. Grandpa put an arm around her shoulder. "Good luck to you in it, honey. Good luck to you from here on." And he hurried out to catch up with Grandma. Mom watched them drive away down the street until the ringing phone pulled her back inside. She picked it up, listened briefly, and answered, "We'll be there." Her eyes drifted over to mine. She spoke in a weary voice, beyond anger, beyond upset. "That was your principal, Dr. Johnson. She wants to see both of us in her office tomorrow morning at 7:30 sharp, Monday, December 4th. Mom and I have to leave half an hour early today in order to be at Tangerine Middle School by 7:30. I packed up my books and my lunch like I was going for a normal day. What did I know? Mom drove tensely, silently, angrily. I can't say that I blame her. In just 1 week, both of her sons had gone from success to failure, from public praise to public shame. I tried to picture Mom in our climate-controlled storage place, finding that gym bag, not recognizing it, wondering whose it was, deciding to open it to find out, staring at the items inside, pulling them out one by one, the awful truth appearing to her gradually, like a slowly developing Polaroid. We pulled up in front of Tangerine Middle at 7:25. Absolutely nothing was happening. None of the karate kickers were on the sidewalk. None of the gangsters were hanging out. None of the buses were pulling into the loop. I never had been there so early before. We walked through the front doors and climbed the stairs to the main office. Dr. Johnson was just inside the glass doors, talking to two other adults, Tomas Cruz and a woman who I recognized from the soccer games. She looked a little like Victor, so I guess she must be Mrs. Guzman. Dr. Johnson shook hands with my mother very seriously. She looked at me and said, "Paul, why don't you wait out in the hallway for a few minutes? We'll call you." Dr. Johnson led the adults in her inner office. I drifted back through the glass doors into the hall, heard light footsteps on the stairs, so I started watching the second floor landing. A familiar brown ponytail appeared, then a familiar face. I said, "Teresa, hi." She didn't really look at me. She came to the top of the stairs and said, "So there you are." I said, "Did they call you in too?" "No, not me. Just Tino and Victor. They're inside." "They are? I didn't see them." "Yeah, they're in there. Dr. Johnson probably put them in the nurse's room. That's where they usually wait." "Oh, why are you here?" "Me? I'm always here early. For my job." "Office aide?" "Yeah, right. That's me." Teresa and I stood together with our backs to the glass wall in the office. We stood for a whole minute like that, in silence, like two strangers waiting for a bus. Then I remembered, and I reached into my backpack. I pulled out the science report, laser printed in 4 colors with a clear plastic binder. I handed it to Teresa. "Here, I was hoping I would run into you. I finished putting together the report. I hope you like it." Teresa took it and studied the title, printed in tall orange letters with black shading. She read it out loud. "The Golden Dawn Tangerine." She leafed through the report, looking at the pie chart for the varieties of citrus grown in Tangerine County and the bar graph for the decline of citrus acreage in Tangerine County. She whispered, "This is beautiful. This is an A+ for sure." Teresa looked me in the eye and smiled, but not for long. Suddenly, like they had sprung a leak, her eyes filled up with big tears that rolled down her cheeks. She shook her head from side to side and demanded to know, "Why did you do this?" "What? Do what?" "All of it." She held up the report. "All of this, all of it. Why did you come to my school and come to my house to work and jump on some coach? Are you crazy? You messed up your whole life. Do you know that?" I'd never seen Teresa angry or upset. Now she was both. I tried to calm her down, but she went on, "Listen, you're not one of these guys. Do you understand that? You're not one of these guys who are sitting up in the office all the time waiting to get punished. You don't even belong here. You don't even live in Tangerine. You live in Lake Windsor Downs, and you're going to have to keep on living there, and you're going to have to go to that high school, and you're going to have to face that coach and everybody else who is in that gym. Tino and Victor don't have to do any of that. Tino and Victor are going to walk away from all this." She looked away, shaking her head at my absolute stupidity. She took several deep breaths. Then she looked back at me and repeated calmly, "So why did you do it? Why did you jump on that coach?" I raised up my shoulders and let them fall. I've thought about that a lot over the last 3 days. I spent a lot of time thinking about stuff. Probably too much. But that night in the gym, I didn't think at all. I just did it. Teresa wiped her cheek on her sleeve. Yeah, well, you really messed up. Tino and Victor got caught anyway. They always do. We fell silent again and settled back into our positions against the wall. I tried to lighten the mood. I said, maybe this is all your fault. You were the first one I met here. You're the one who took me around. She didn't know if I was kidding or not. She said, so how's that making my fault? You introduced me to Tino and Victor. Yeah, well, you said you wanted to play soccer. But you didn't have to do that. You could have let me sink or swim on my own. Now she smiled slightly. Yeah, I could have let you sink. She pointed to the office. Dr. Johnson told us that some kids were coming here from Lake Windsor because their school fell down in a sinkhole. I don't know. I guess I figured that you'd all be looking down your noses at us. And some of those kids were, but not you. You acted like you were happy to be here. You liked it here. Then you said you wanted to play on the soccer team. I don't know. I guess I felt sorry for you, especially when I thought about Victor and those guys might do to you. The door to Dr. Johnson's office opened. Teresa and I both looked in that direction. She said, whenever Luis talked about you, he called you Paul. I'm going to start doing that too. She took me by the arm. Come on, Paul. She led me to the office. Dr. Johnson walked out and said, Teresa, will you go ask Miss Pollard to come in here and bring Miss Paul Fisher's vial with her? Teresa gave me a silent squeeze on the arm and took off to do the errand. I peered into the inner office. I could see Mom's profile. She was crying. Dr. Johnson said, okay, Paul, come with me. You can wait in the nurse's room. We'll be calling you boys in one at a time. She led me down the short hall and opened the door to the nurse's room. Tino and Victor were in there, sitting in black chairs against the white wall. They seemed smaller, younger than I remember, like little kids. They certainly weren't nervous. I guess they'd been here too many times. Tino continued to stare straight ahead, but Victor popped up in his seat and started in on Dr. Johnson. Oh, no, Dr. Johnson, you're bringing in the wrong boy in here now. Fisherman was just sitting up there with his mama and papa. He fell out of those bleachers and he fainted or something. He's lucky he landed on that dude. That broke his fall. He turned to Tino for support. Fisherman fainted out there in the grove last week. Am I right? Tino ignored him. Dr. Johnson, he might have a brain tumor making him faint like that. That boy needs an x-ray. Dr. Johnson shook her head and said quietly, things are bad enough, Victor. Don't go making it worse. Now, come along with me. Victor opened his eyes wide and looked at me. Then he got up and followed Dr. Johnson out of the room. I sat down on his chair next to Tino. He surprised me by speaking right away. When you get in there, don't be running your mouth like that fool, Victor. All you say to Dr. Johnson is, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am, and thank you, ma'am. Understand? You take your 3-week suspension and you go home. I said, 3 weeks? You figured that's what it'll be? Yeah. Tino shifted around in his chair, but he still wasn't looking at me. He went on, and you can tell Tuna for me that we weren't disrespecting his brother or anything like that. We just had to take care of business. I think he knows that. Yeah, well, you tell him I said so. Okay. Suddenly, Dr. Johnson opened the door and signaled that it was Tino's turn to follow her. I was left in the nurse's room by myself, staring at the eye chart. It seemed like it was about 2 minutes later when she came back for me. I followed her into the inner office. Mom was sitting in the same spot. Her eyes were red, but she was no longer crying. Dr. Johnson stood behind her desk, held up a thin white booklet called the Student Code, and said, I've already explained this to your mother, Paul. The school board has set down in its policies in this booklet, and we are all obliged to follow them. It is my duty to explain to you what violation you committed and what penalty you will receive. She held the booklet out in case I wanted to read it. She explained, your violation is called a level 4 infraction. In this case, assaulting a teacher or other school board employee. This is the most serious level of infraction. The penalty for this and for any other level 4 infraction is expulsion. Dr. Johnson paused to make sure I understood. I don't think I did. I was thinking to myself, 3 weeks? I'm supposed to get 3 weeks. She continued, as of today, you are expelled from all Tangerine County public schools for the remainder of this academic year. She paused again and looked at me. I heard myself say, yes, ma'am. Dr. Johnson sat down the student code booklet and asked, do you have any questions about this? I thought of no, ma'am, and thank you, ma'am, but I couldn't say them. I was too confused. And did I have any questions? Oh, and I did have questions. I said, what about Victor and Tino? Are they expelled too? Dr. Johnson frowned. I could tell that she didn't want to talk about them. She pointed back at the student code and said, no, Paul, their violation falls under the level 3 infraction, fighting with another student. The penalty for that is 3-week suspension. I nodded. What else could I say but, thank you, ma'am. Dr. Johnson moved towards the door, so Mom got to her feet. Dr. Johnson said, your mother has decided to waive your right to an appeal. Basically, Paul, you did it, you got caught, you got punished. On the positive side, you've already completed enough days to get credit for this semester. There are options available to you. Your mother has selected the option of enrolling you in a private school to complete the second half of the 7th grade. We were all moving out the door by now, into the main office. The other kids were coming in and out, and Dr. Johnson held out her hand, and I shook it. She said, I wish you well in that option, Paul. Goodbye, Mrs. Fisher. And she was gone, just like that. I guess I'd expected more. I guess I'd expected a pep talk or a stern speech, but she got rid of me as quickly as she'd gotten rid of Victor and Tino. The office was starting to fill up with kids, and Dr. Johnson was needed elsewhere. The day had begun. The students at Tangerine Middle School were doing what they always did, but I was not among them. I was no longer one of them. That realization hit me suddenly, like a smack in the face. I followed Mom down the 2 flights of stairs, keeping my head lowered so that I wouldn't have to look back at anybody. When we got to the front door, I could hear the sounds of the mob of kids outside. The karate kickers had arrived. So had the gangsters. They were all doing what they did every morning, being wild, being loud, until they saw me. Then, in a heartbeat, all of it stopped. They all stopped what they were doing to stare at me. Mom and I stood at the top of the step and stared back at them. She said, "Paul, what do they want?" I could hear them mumbling from different areas of the crowd. They were saying stuff like, "That's him!" and "That's Fisher!" One of the biggest and baddest eighth grade gangsters moved towards us with his boys right behind him. Mom let out a frightened noise and whispered, "What are they doing?" I turned towards her and said out of the corner of my mouth, "No fear, Mom. Show them no fear." I walked slowly down the steps. Mom stayed right where she was. The mob parted slightly, just enough to swallow me up. That big eighth grader held his fist out, and I put mine down on top of it. He said, "All right, Fisher." Suddenly, they were all on top of me. All these guys I didn't really know. Guys who didn't really know me. They started pounding me on the back, rubbing my hair, shaking both of my hands at once. They were saying stuff like, "Way to be, Fisher. Hang tough. Keep your head up, man." It was a strange moment for me. Among those big, bad strangers, their words surrounded me and picked me up and moved me along towards the car. I could hear Mom yelling over the top of them, "Paul, are you all right in there?" Mom had worked her way around to the driver's side door and was fumbling with the keys. I opened my door and turned back to the mob. I couldn't think of anything to say, so I just stuck my thumb in the air awkwardly and slipped into my seat. They turned and headed back to their usual places. Mom quickly locked the door and we peeled out. By now she was more puzzled than scared. She waited until we were safely away to ask, "What was that? What was that all about?" I curled my lip. They know I'm a bad dude when they see one. "Paul, you aren't a bad dude." "Oh no?" I jerked my thumb back towards the mob. "Did you see any of those wusses getting expelled from every public school in Tangerine?" Mom breathed out a loud sigh. You'd think those would be the worst words a mother could hear. She shook her head back and forth. I didn't know if she was going to laugh or cry. She laughed. "Not in this family." We drove through downtown Tangerine. Mom said, "Well, I'll tell you, I, for one, am glad you're out of that place." She wasn't glad for very long. I informed her, "I'm going back, Mom, next year. I already talked to the coach about it, and I'm going to make the all-county team." Mom said with certainty, "You can't do that." And then with less certainty, "I don't think you can do that." I quoted Gino's words. "They make exception for a lot of guys. They're going to make one for me." "We'll have to see about that." "There's nothing to see about. I've made up my mind." Mom shook her head some more, but she didn't seem to be upset. She certainly wasn't crying. Maybe she'd gone over the edge. Maybe we both had. For whatever reason, a strange feeling of calm came over us. We reached Route 89 and turned south. I said, "Wrong way, Mom." "Depends on where you're going." "Where are we going?" "The mall. We're going to buy you some clothes that fit." "Okay. And some uniforms." "Some what?" "Blue pants, white shirts, blue ties." "You're kidding." "Nope. This is your option." "You're sending me to St. Anthony's?" "That's right. Dr. Johnson called the principal for me, Sister Mary Margaret. She agreed that you could start there on Wednesday in seventh grade on a trial basis." "A trial basis? You mean she wants to find out if I'm too bad a dude to keep there?" "Yes, I guess that's what she means." "You mean that I'll be walking in there with a bad reputation? That kids will fear me?" "I wouldn't go that far." "Well, I would. I know all about fear." I thought about the other new schools that I had entered. "Do you realize, Mom, that I've never been anything but a nerd? And now I'm entering this school, this nerd school, not as a fellow nerd, but as a feared and notorious outlaw." "It's not a nerd school." "Oh, yes, it is. I've been there, October 12th. Some of them may remember me from that day. I rode up there with the War Eagles. We laid them to waste, 10-0. There was fear in their eyes, and there will be again when we walk in on Wednesday." "Paul, please, you need to take this option very seriously. Not everybody gets a second chance." I thought, yeah, tell me about it, Mom. We pulled into the mall, and then we went on an enormous shopping spree, unprecedented in my lifetime. Mom was out of control. She let me buy everything that I even thought about wanting. She never said no. She never even hesitated. Bag after bag, store after store, sneakers, jeans, jackets, shirts, socks, underwear. When we got home, I went upstairs with a pair of lawn-sized garbage bags. I dumped out the old clothes from my dresser, and then I pulled out the old clothes from my closet, and I filled both bags and went back to get two more. I put everything into those big green bags and then piled them up in the garage for a Goodwill pickup. Then I started to work on my new stuff, pulling out pins, cutting out off tags, throwing away paper, drawer after drawer, hanger after hanger. I filled up my dresser and my closet with new clothes that fit. Dad had to take Eric down to the police station this morning to talk to Sergeant Rojas. They were there from 7:30 until 10:30. When they got back, Eric went straight up to his room. Dad came into the kitchen and told Mom and me, Arthur Bauer's trying to blame Eric. He says that Eric put him up to it. Eric denies it. He said that Arthur misunderstood him. It's a big mess. He poured himself a cup of coffee and added, the police will sort it out. It's their job, not mine. I said, what do the witnesses say? They say they know that Antoine Thomas and Brian Baylor have given statements to the sergeant. They both say that it was Arthur who actually assaulted the guy. The guy's name was Luis. Dad nodded and corrected himself. I'm sorry, Luis. I thought about Eric's group of flunkies. I asked, what about friendly witnesses? Eric and Arthur don't have any friends, not since they started rounding up all of that stolen jewelry. No, nobody but Arthur Bauer Sr. is saying that it was a fair fight. Mom had her elbows flat on the table and both hands under her chin, like she was holding her own severed head. She asked, so what's going to happen now? Dad answered calmly, almost casually, as if he didn't have anything to do with him. Now the wheels of justice will turn, slowly but surely. Each of them will have to answer for whatever it was that he did. I'm not interfering anymore. I looked back at Mom. She, at least, seemed worried about her firstborn son. Dad, on the other hand, seemed more like those friends who had abandoned Eric, who now regretted even getting involved with him in the first place. He turned to me. Paul, Sergeant Rojas wants a statement from you two. She wants you to type up a paragraph or two describing exactly what you saw and what you heard. You know, what really happened. You can give it to me and I'll drop it at the sheriff's department. I said, okay, I can do that. The phone rang in the great room. I walked over to the coffee table and picked it up. I heard a familiar voice. You gotta get yourself you gotta get yourself a better lawyer, homeboy. Tino? Yeah, I guess you're right. So, what's up? What are you gonna do with yourself? I'm starting at St. Anthony's on Wednesday. Tino snorted with contempt. St. Anthony's? Those losers? You gotta be kidding me. Hey, I didn't say I'm gonna play for them. I'm playing for the War Eagles next year. Oh yeah? You don't think you're gonna start, do you? I know I'm gonna start. Yeah, well, we'll see about that. What about you? I asked him. What are you gonna be doing? Oh, I got lots to do. You know, that's what they call a blessing in disguise. Luis has been advertising the Golden Dawns all in the trade papers. There's a big response, just like he said there would be. He's got orders from growers all over Florida, from Texas, from California, even down in Mexico. I gotta help our daddy get all those orders filled. I gotta help him with a lot of other stuff too that Luis did. Tino paused and then he said awkwardly, Hey, fisherman, anytime you want to come out and work in the groves, you come on out. You're on the crew. You know what I'm saying? I knew what he was saying, and I answered, yeah, thanks. I want to. That's something I really want to do. You just tell me when. You know when. Time and temperature, right? When the sun's going down and the wind's coming up and the temperature's 39, 38, 37. You know what's going to happen next, and you know where we'll be. I'll be there too. All right. Maybe I'll even stay awake this time. Tino snorted. Then there was a pause, and he said, Hey, good look at that St. Anthony's place. I don't know anything about it except that we beat their butts every year. They got to wear uniforms. Is that right? Yeah, and they got nuns teaching there. No way, nuns? Yeah. All right, well, you don't go getting wild like you do. I don't want to hear about you jumping out of the bleachers on the Pope or anything like that. No, you won't. You take care of yourself, brother. I'll see you in the groves. Yeah, bye. And I hung up. And I heard the word brother echoing long afterward. I looked up at the ceiling and heard Eric pacing back and forth in that cage that he had made for himself. Tuesday, December 5th, later. I came upstairs after dinner to write out my account of the crime for Sergeant Rojas. I logged in and went back through all my old journal entries from Houston until today. Then I started writing. I didn't finish until after 9 p.m. I started with the basic facts, a paragraph or two, but I couldn't stop there. I had too much to say. I had started writing about Luis and what he meant to the people around him and how they depended on him and why they looked up to him. And I tried to write the same thing about Eric and what he meant to the people around him. How did they depend on him? Why did they look up to him? I don't suppose the police are interested in all that. That's not their job. But it is part of the truth, a big part. And as Antoine Thomas told me, the truth shall set you free. I went downstairs and handed the disc to Mom and Dad and said, here's the whole truth. Here's what really happened. I went through the kitchen and poured myself a glass of orange juice. When I walked back through the great room, Mom and Dad both pulled up the chairs in the alcove. They were staring hard at the computer screen. Wednesday, December 6th. First day of school, take 3. I got into my blue pants, white shirt, blue tie, black socks, and black shoes and went down to the kitchen. Neither Mom nor Dad mentioned my disc over breakfast, but I was surprised to hear Mom say, Paul, we've talked about it and we've decided that your father will drive you to St. Anthony's today. At 7:30, Dad and I walked out into the cold Florida morning. The light wind was blowing in the west, carrying the muck fire away from us towards the Gulf to the east. The sun was rising behind a long row of gray clouds. I stopped and looked at them, jagged and red-peaked, looming like the distant mountain range. We pulled out of the development and headed north, past the gates and the guardhouses, past the high tension wires and the osprey nests, towards the Lake Windsor campus. When we stopped at the light on Route 89 and Seagull Way, Dad pointed over to the right. He said, "You see that? That's my Castillo's tree." I looked where Dad pointed and saw the big laurel oak. It had been planted on the front lawn of the high school between the road and the bus lanes. It looked healthy enough, strong enough, but it was bound in crisscross of wires attached to white metal stakes. Dad added, "Those stakes are just temporary, until it can stand on its own." We drove to the next light and turned right. We headed east towards the glowing colors of the mountain range, towards the glowing colors of the citrus groves. I thought to myself, Mike Castillo has his tree, and that's good, but Luis has his tree too, and he'll have many, many more. Soon the road narrowed to 2 lanes, and we were surrounded by the groves, surrounded by the beauty of it all. I stared through the window at the endless rows of oranges and tangerines and lemons flying past us on either side. I rolled down the window and let it all in. The air was clear and cold, and the car immediately filled with the scent of golden dawn.